Great, thank you, Paul. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. As Paul mentioned, my name is Stephanie Vasquez, and I'm a co-chair of the Health and Nutrition Workgroup. And I worked with the Environment and Sustainability Workgroup to organize this event on urban sanitation and impacts to health. We purposely designed this event to be a few weeks out from World Toilet Day, which was celebrated on November 19th, really to continue the momentum to increase awareness for the 4.2 billion people living without access to safely managed sanitation. We also intentionally focused this session on urban sanitation as urbanization continues to increase across the globe and challenges related to safe sanitation grow with it. And so we also know that the lack of access to affordable and safe sanitation services have contributed to diarrheal diseases, and the connection between poor sanitation and public health is evident. And municipalities with poor sanitation systems often have the highest mortality rates among children under 5, along with high levels of malnutrition and poverty. So today we've brought together thought leaders, practitioners in the field to really discuss these challenges and opportunities to increase safe sanitation for all. And so we're delighted to have this session moderated by Martin Gambrill, who's the lead water and sanitation specialist who has worked at the World Bank for over 2 decades on the preparation and implementation of water, sanitation, urban development, and related programs in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And Martin currently leads the bank's citywide Inclusive Sanitation Global Initiative. So we're all grateful for your participation today and look forward to the dialogue we'll have on this topic. And so with that, I'll close it out and hand it over to Martin, who's going to lead today's session.
Many thanks, Stephanie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. As Stephanie said, my name is Martin Gambrill. I'm a lead water and sanitation specialist at the World Bank, and I'm currently leading our global initiative on citywide inclusive sanitation, about which you'll learn more today, among other fascinating topics. So I have the pleasure of moderating this interesting SID webinar for you today, and we have a series of great presenters and presentations in store for you. In terms of protocol, please mute your microphone and turn your videos off. I'm sure you're doing that anyway, unless of course you're talking or presenting, and that will help us with bandwidth. We also ask that you use the chat box liberally today to pose any questions or comments to the presenters. And we've asked the presenters to respond to these both directly in the chat box following their respective presentations, as well as in the Q&A session, assuming we don't run out of time for the Q&A session. So today we'll be looking at the nexus, as Stephanie said, of urban sanitation services, the planning and delivering of them for all, as well as the health and other dimensions of urban sanitation. And we will be doing so from a number of different, and I hope you'll agree, compelling perspectives. We'll have a series of 5 presentations followed by a Q&A session. And in order to keep to our tight schedule, I'll be alerting the speakers when they have 1 minute of their allocated time remaining. You can find detailed bios of the distinguished presenters on the SID webinar webpage. So first up, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the movers and shakers of the global sanitation sector, Kate Medlicott from the World Health Organization. Kate is the team lead for sanitation at the WHO and has led a number of their key pieces of work on sanitation and health over the years, including their recent publication together with UNICEF on the State of the World's Sanitation Report, which was launched a couple of weeks ago on World Toilet Day, and about which you will now hear some more from her. So Kate, thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, the state of the world sanitation, I mean, this is, I work for WHO. Sanitation and progress on sanitation underpins like so much of what we're trying to do. So we've produced this report, bringing together the health, the economic case, the data on where we're at and what we need to do to accelerate as a WHO and UNICEF report. But of course, it's a resource for the sector, for all of us wanting to make a strong case for sanitation. Next slide. And the reason that we're doing this, of course, is because we're alarmingly off track to meet SDG 6 targets. And at the current rate of progress, we're going to be into the 22nd century. So my grandchildren, great-grandchildren will be alive by the time we achieve safely managed sanitation. Clearly, that's too slow. What's more, sanitation is a human right. So we really should be making faster progress. And when we say a human right, it's not just a right to a toilet, but a right for all of us not to have to live in environments that are contaminated by other people's feces. Next slide. So where are we at? Okay, you hear these numbers a lot, 2.2 billion without even a basic toilet, 4.2, that's more than half of humanity that don't have safely managed sanitation services, nearly 700 million still practicing open defecation, 400 million in schools, it goes on, 10% of healthcare facilities without sanitation, that's probably an underestimate. We are making progress, but you know, you can see these numbers are fairly dire. Next slide. And you know, the consequences are really stark of not making progress on sanitation, and we're failing to claim this myriad of health benefits that comes from safely managed sanitation, whether that's in the nutrition agenda with nutrition and stunting in children, whether it's cholera that kills really rapidly, all of the well-being dimensions of health, of dignity, safety, gender equality, the conditions of sanitation workers, and of course the financial costs around the burden on the healthcare system of dealing with preventable infections, lost income, foregone educational opportunities, and so forth. Next slide. But before I jump into the details, I really wanted to reinforce that when we're talking about progress on sanitation and improving health, we really have to be looking after the whole sanitation chain that you see here. A break in any of those links leads to health risks. Next slide. And I think if you take anything away from my presentation today, the thing I want you to remember is that sanitation is a public good, and it's an essential public service which is foundational to healthy populations and prosperous societies. And we really have to change this mindset that sanitation is largely in the realm of household responsibility, and really work with governments to make sure that they're ensuring safety along the whole sanitation chain. Next slide. And then one of the reasons I think that people point to for why we're not doing this is because they think, oh, it's so big, it's so expensive. And that's true perhaps. The estimated costs that shown in the report is 105 billion for safely managed services, or 36 for basic services. But what's clear is the costs of inaction are greater. It's estimated that there's a 5-to-1 economic benefit in return for every dollar put in on sanitation. So it might seem expensive, but the costs of inaction are higher. Next slide. And so where are we at? If we look at, this is some of the funding data from GLASS, and what you can see clearly here is that, that there's a big funding gap that needs to be filled. We're currently investing around $1.50 per head. That needs to go up to $24 per head to meet the targets by 2030. Next slide. So clearly we need to imagine a dramatic increase in pace. Next slide. I won't dwell on this, but in terms of what we're aiming for, the sanitation and health guidelines kind of lay out these 4 recommendation areas about what we need to do to protect health. And then I'm going to sort of talk a bit more now about the how we get there. Next slide. I just want to talk about the pace, the rate of acceleration we need to achieve. So you can see the orange line there for open defecation, about the rate of progress we've been making in the past will get us there by 2030, but we need a dramatic acceleration in basic services, and even more so in safely managed services. This is even doubling as fast as any country went in the MDG period. And in least developed countries, it's actually a 7-fold acceleration that's needed. Next slide. So by this point, you might be feeling a bit depressed, but actually history shows that this can be done. Countries like Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, Malaysia made massive progress in the 60s and 70s. And at the time that they did that, their per capita income levels were about the same as many sub-Saharan African countries are now. We've seen it more recently in India making massive progress, and countries like Ethiopia and Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, Indonesia, and Burkina Faso have made progress in excess of 50 percentage points since 2000. So there are reasons to be optimistic. Next slide. So what I would like to talk about now is like, what are the kind of areas we need to focus on to accelerate? Next slide. And these are actually outlined in the SDG6 Global Acceleration Framework, which came out earlier this year, and the State of Sanitation report structures the acceleration we need around these 5 areas. Next slide. So the first one, of course, is governance. We have to have this strong leadership, effective coordination and regulation of sanitation services for this to happen. We have to make sure, this seems so basic, but it's not there in many cases, that sanitation is defined as an essential service that the government is responsible and can be held accountable for. We need to make sure that it's recognised as a multi-sectoral issue, that it's backed up by policies and plans, and really critically, we need to make sure that those policies and plans support a mix of different system types and approaches and regulation across the chain. Next slide. The second is around public finance. We absolutely have to have smart public finance put in place. We recognise it as a public good that demands public finance, but that's only the foundation. We can be working to strategically use those government investments to unlock other sources of funding through different forms of tariffs and taxes, repayable finance, and of course leveraging the private sector. Next slide. Next, yeah. So the third is around capacity development. The fact that we've kind of looked at sanitation as a household responsibility is reflected now in this really historically low emphasis that's placed on capacity shortfalls. And that's not just workforce. We definitely need a larger workforce with better skills and more dignified jobs and working. But that also needs to extend to capacity as it pertains to organisational development, resourcing, research, and so forth. Next slide. Reliable data is absolutely key. In order to kind of get that strong political commitment in the first place, we need really high quality data to make that case, and we need to use that data to allow governments to target investment smartly, to monitor progress, and to make course corrections. Next slide. The final one is around innovation. You know, there's a lot of flourishing innovation that's happening in the sanitation sector right now, and we need more of that, especially to future-proof the sector to things like climate change, but many of the challenges that are coming. And we need to make sure that the systems that we have through regulation, performance and standards actually encourage that innovation and don't stifle new ideas and entrepreneurship. Next slide. So this is a little bit, you're going to have to squint to look at it, but just my final thought is I want you to kind of imagine 2 futures. One in which we, underneath there, where we continue with business as usual and we leave all of these myriad of benefits of sanitation on the table, or one which we accelerate and claim all of these things around child survival, nutrition, recreational water quality, you know, there's this whole range of things, antimicrobial resistance, they're all there, food safety. So thank you. I think I've gone over my time. Next slide. I will leave it there, hand back to you, Martin, and please do take a look at the report on our website and the underlying reports that from JMP Glass and the guidelines that contribute here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was great. And no, you were on time. So thank you so much. That was obviously initially, as you said, a sobering view of the reality of sanitation services globally, which certainly firmly grounds our discussion and the challenges facing our sector across the world, but which also provided a roadmap through better governance, financing, capacity development, data and monitoring, and innovation, indicating ways in which we can advance the sector. And I like the fact you made reference to the East Asian tiger stories, the Swaj Bharat in India and Ethiopia, and other examples of where change can be made. And I especially like, because I've seen it before, the Tale of Two Cities graphic that you ended with there, nicely summarizing the challenge, but also the opportunity of embracing the sanitation agenda. So please place any questions or comments for Kate in the chat box. I see there was one for you already there, Kate. We'll be monitoring those and either providing written responses or in the Q&A after our 5 presentations, time permitting. So we'll move on to our second presentation. Next up, we have Liz Jordan. Liz is a water and sanitation specialist in USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene, where she focuses on supporting missions on WASH-related strategic planning and project design. At USAID, Liz also leads efforts to develop technical guidance, build capacity of USAID staff, and oversee WASH research activities. And today she's going to talk to us about USAID's urban sanitation work and their perspectives on it. Over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Martin. And thank you, Kate, for laying out the challenges so clearly. I'm not going to spend any more time on that since I think we've all, now really understood the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And, at USAID, we know that in this increasingly urbanized world, we have to pay attention to services within cities. Without safe management of waste, we're going to have environmental challenges, health challenges, and governance challenges, really. So within USAID, we've been developing a series of technical guidance notes, and we have one on urban sanitation. So my presentation today is going to focus on some highlights of that, although the full brief is available online for anyone who wants to dive in further. Next slide. So as Kate mentioned, when we're talking about urban sanitation, we have to think about the whole service chain. It's more than just the toilets. I think when we've been in a tradition of focusing on rural sanitation, we tend to think about the household access first and foremost. But within urban environments, we have to think about the whole service chain, all the way from containment to the safe disposal. And we really have to have all parts of this chain functioning in order to have safe sanitation. Technologies and approaches at every step along this chain are connected. So you can't just tackle one piece without thinking about what it means for the rest. In developed countries, we're used to thinking about waterborne sewerage as the urban sanitation solution, but that's actually really limited in most of the places we at USAID are working in. And so we tend to focus more on on-site sanitation, such as pit latrines or septic tanks, and then fecal sludge management and treatment services. Next slide. One tool we often like to point to is the fecal flow or shit flow diagram, which can really help us unpack where the challenges are in that service chain. So this example is from Maputo, Mozambique. And if you're looking at it, if you just did an assessment of household access to sanitation, like we often talk about, you might think that 99% of the population has sanitation, and that looks pretty great. But by tracking through the whole service chain and figuring out where the waste is going, we can see that actually 54% of the waste is being disposed unsafely into the environment, and only 46% is actually safely treated. And we can look here to see where are the biggest problems. So in this example, you can see that the manual emptying of latrines is really the largest flow into the environment. We can also look at this and see that only 9% of the population has a connection to the sewerage network. And so it's really more important to focus on that 90% that's using on-site facilities. So these are, the kind of tools we would look at within our programming to start to target interventions. Next slide. So from here, I'm going to step through the service chain a little bit and just talk a little bit about the types of programming USAID does and some examples of what we've done. So within containment, the type of technology that gets used is really going to affect the rest of the service chain. This could include latrines that are connected to a pipe sewerage network, septic tanks or pit latrines, or even container-based sanitation. In general, what we see in the cities we work in is that the containment is insufficient, and it actually impacts the ability to empty waste. If you have a poor quality pit latrine, you often can't mechanically empty that, and it leads to even more unsafe disposal. Private household sanitation is obviously the goal we're all aiming for, and it's what most households and governments prefer, but it's sometimes unrealistic when we're programming in dense urban areas, particularly informal settlements. They may not be possible because of high flood zones, or people who are renters who can't make that investment, or just density of environment. And so in those cases, communal or shared latrines, where we have compound living, or public latrines might be the right solution in the interim to make sure that waste is being managed. But when we start to talk about public latrines, we have to be careful that they're well managed. The best ways we've seen that done is typically through some sort of performance contract, which really ensures the service quality. Our programming takes market-based approaches to increasing access to household sanitation. This is true in both rural and urban environments. And what we really aim to do is take on a facilitation role, aiming to support the suppliers and entrepreneurs who sell latrine products and provide other sanitation services. So for example, our program in West Africa, this picture here is from Benin, where that program is working. The Sanitation Service Delivery Project is training entrepreneurs to provide those sanitation services and really helping them to fill the gap. Next slide. That next step of the chain is the emptying and transport. And so when we're talking about the on-site systems rather than waterborne sewerage, waste must be emptied and then transported safely to a designated site. It can be vacuum trucks or other mechanical emptying technologies, or it can be manual emptying, which can be dangerous for the people doing it and has to be very carefully monitored. There are some cities that maintain a fleet of vacuum trucks that provide the emptying services, but more often we really see the private sector filling that gap. One challenge there is that they can be unregulated. Governments may not want to step in to really manage that system because they see it as temporary until sewerage is available. But we really have to focus on the solution because on-site sanitation is going to be present for a while. And when there's no regulation, we can often see unhygienic procedures dominating, particularly by informal providers. But whether we're talking about private or public sector provision of this service, it is important to think about commercial principles. Management of the service is just as important as the type of technology we are using. And it has to be financially viable, either through user fees from households or public funding. So one area USAID has been focusing on is on filling this finance gap for private sector providers for emptying and transport services. For example, in Senegal, our Washfin project is supporting multiple large sanitation service providers in Dakar to improve the operations and then also link them to financial institutions and help them gain loans. So as a result of continuous engagement with both the providers and the pool of financial institutions, there's 15 Senegalese banks and 3 multinational banks or investment funds who've expressed interest in the urban sanitation sector. And there's loans under discussion totaling about $6 million. We also do work with public providers for emptying and transport where that's more prevalent. For example, in Indonesia, USAID's IU Wash Plus project is partnering with 25 local governments, and they established an innovative service for scheduled desludging. So scheduled desludging increases the efficiency of the operations by desludging multiple households per trip to the treatment plant, and then eliminating some of the household anxiety over when the septic tanks might be emptied. They developed the framework that's on this slide for scaling up regular desludging services based on 7 key aspects that need to be in place to make that system work. And the services are actually financed by a tariff attached to the regular monthly water bill or added to property taxes. So they come via public financing mechanisms.
We've got 2 minutes, Liz.
Great, next slide. So on this last step of the chain, focusing on treatment and disposal, this is often neglected, and that means that there can be illegal dumping by the pit emptiers into oceans, rivers, landfill sites. And in effect, this is creating the same risk we have with open defecation, but more concentrated and often in poorer areas or near informal settlements. You know, one challenge is that many countries don't even have the facilities to safely treat fecal sludge, especially if they're focusing on wastewater treatment plants. And in some places, there's insufficient treatment facilities of any type, whether fecal sludge or wastewater, and communities might oppose construction of new sites. Typically, the treatment facilities are charging tipping fees to the desludgers who bring waste to the site, which can really create a perverse incentive where dumping illegally is free, but bringing it to the treatment site costs money. So one way we've addressed this through our programming is focusing on either regulations or restructuring incentives where payments only get made when sludge actually makes it to the treatment site. And sometimes GIS monitoring has really helped with that. There's growing interest in reuse of treated waste. There's potential that waste can be used as fertilizer or an energy source. And there's a lot of ongoing experiments in this that are really interesting. The concept is really attractive, but one key piece is how to make the market for it work. So in this case, the technology is probably less of the challenge than really the business model around it.
1 minute, Liz.
Great, next slide. So ensuring that everyone benefits from safely managed sanitation requires specific approaches to target the underserved. So this slide is showing one example from Indonesia from the SID-US Plus project, where they worked very hard to make sure they were actually targeting people in the bottom 40% by wealth category. And to reach that bottom 40, the project developed a hotspot approach that utilized national census data, identifying poor households to develop a map of the villages with high poverty density, and then working in those areas. And after just 3 years of that project, the monitoring is showing that they are reaching the bottom 40 more effectively than previous programs. Next slide. So to conclude here, you know, our overall approach is really aligned with the principles of citywide inclusive sanitation, which I know is going to be the focus of the next presentation. And we need to really focus on the whole chain, make sure we're working citywide and being inclusive, applying commercial principles. And lastly, we're going to be aiming for strategic incremental improvements in partnership with many other players. This is a really big challenge, and our programming, we know, is not going to solve it alone. So we're really focused on how we work with others and tackle pieces of the problem. So on the final slide here, I just have the link to where you can find this tech brief and the other technical briefs. Go to the next slide. Since I was definitely not able to cover it all, hopefully people can go here if you want to read more. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Liz. And we can paste those links in the chat box as well. Thank you for that. It's some very clear takeaways from your presentation. Great to see you drawing on the importance of us understanding the full sanitation service chain and breaking your presentation down into those parts, but also the role of some tools such as the SFDs for advocacy and planning purposes. And obviously you focused on the challenges of, you know, the numerous challenges of different dimensions of fecal sludge management. So great, many thanks for that. And again, please, any questions or comments for Liz, please put them in the chat box. We're going to move straight on to our third presentation. My pleasure to introduce you to my World Bank colleague, Nandita Kotwal. Nandita is a water supply and sanitation consultant at the bank and is a member of our core citywide inclusive sanitation team. She'll give us an overview of the bank's CWIS work, including on our efforts in urban sanitation planning within this framework. Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've heard a lot from Liz and Kate and even Stephanie on the challenges in urban sanitation. So I won't really spend a lot of time on this data. So we can just probably go to the next slide. And thank you. I'd just like to point out that even with this nexus, it is important to know that much of this urbanization is unplanned and informal. So traditional approaches to sanitation planning and service provision are based on formal planned growth. How do we plan then for this informality? Next slide. We've seen this kind of figure even in the previous presentations. So from the previous MDG focus on containment, the SDG target 6.2 now looks at the whole sanitation service chain, from containment at the household through emptying and conveyance to treatment and hopefully reuse or final disposal. If this is the case, should we be looking at simplified or conventional sewers, at non-network sanitation using latrines or septic tanks, or at emerging service models such as those container-based sanitation entrepreneurs? Next slide, please. So how do we meet these SDG targets? The citywide inclusive sanitation approach to urban sanitation allows us to do just that. And this is something that we have developed, and the World Bank has been at the forefront of this movement together with other key development partners, including the Gates Foundation, WaterAid, academic institutions, and other NGOs. SID-US aims to shift the paradigm of urban sanitation to focus on the whole sanitation service chain and on access for all, especially the poor. It promotes a range of technical solutions, both on-site and sewered, centralized or decentralized. It integrates financial, policy, institutional, regulatory, and social dimensions of urban sanitation and harmonizes complementary solutions with related urban services, such as water supply, drainage, and solid waste management. SID-US means that we need to think differently and look at business as unusual, as Kate also mentioned. We've been using these principles in a lot of the World Bank projects and through activities of other development partners as well. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by thinking differently? Firstly, this is one of the examples. These programs connect households to existing and new sewers through a combination of enforcement and incentives. Many of these connection programs are in Latin American cities and are focused on different aspects: financial, legal, policy, regulations, social, and technical aspects. We also have recently launched a new report on World Toilet Day that looks at how to, different case studies on how to connect the unconnected households to existing and new sewer networks. Next slide, please. Another way to avoid people not connecting to sanitation infrastructure is by using the condominial approach, like the one used in Brazil, as you can see from the pictures here, which is based on a participatory design and construction with full engagement of households. This decentralized approach can reduce investment costs by as much as 50% when compared to conventional sewers, and can maximize household connections. Next slide, please. In terms of reuse, here you can see on the top left is an example from Cochabamba, Bolivia. Before the wastewater treatment plant was completed, it looks like an arid moon-like landscape. And if you look at bottom right, it's the same picture, but it has lush agricultural land surrounding the completed wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater effluent was used to irrigate maize all year round. In fact, farmers donated land to the treatment plant as long as they were guaranteed access to effluent for irrigation of their crops. On the other end, you can see compost production from treated fecal sludge in Bolivia, which is on the lower left picture, and the lower left higher picture is of fuel briquette production from fecal sludge in Kenya. Next slide, please. Another way to think differently is through innovative container-based sanitation approaches. This has been especially effective in low-income and unplanned communities. The top right picture is from Haiti and the rest are from Bolivia. And you can explore a bit more on our website, and I'll post in the chat box the link to it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Can you go back? Great, thank you. So this example is taken from the municipality of eThekwini in South Africa, whose capital is Durban. The image spans, I think because it's PDF, we can't see the change in the image, but what usually happens is the image, you can see an aerial view of how the population has grown over 2 years. So for the 3.5 million population, it's fairly distributed between urbanized areas and a large rural fringe. So the utility provides sewerage in formal urban areas and temporary community toilet blocks in dense, unplanned, informal areas until these areas are upgraded. And in low-income, low-density areas without any on-plot water supplies, the utility provides on-site facilities, which it empties every 5 years. But if people want to do it more frequently, it charges a service fee. Next slide. Okay, so I'll take you now in the next few slides through some of the planning tools and resources that we at the World Bank use to address impacts of sanitation on health. Next slide. So one of these is Kenya's Nakuru County, which is undertaking a participatory strategic planning process to understand and address service and institutional gaps. This has been replicated in other counties as well and showcases planning at a county level, exploring the urban, peri-urban, and rural continuum. Next slide. Thank you. So this is another tool which has been widely used by our project teams. It's called the Costing and Planning tool, and it's also freely available. It proposes a menu of options that fits your city's context. In this example, you can see Dakar in Senegal, and we can see different technical solutions that are adapted to each depending on different variables such as accessibility, space, water availability. But getting to those mixed solutions was a gradual process. We are also in the process of adding a cost-benefit analysis tab, hopefully, to this tool, which will consider health and environmental impacts. Next slide. Thank you, Martin. So the Sanitation Rapid Assessment tool, this was developed in collaboration with the project team and government counterparts in 22 secondary cities in Ethiopia. And it's used to make quick, no regret priority sanitation decisions. But this process is in parallel with traditional longer term feasibility studies. It's already been adapted in Nigeria and is in the process of being adapted in Kenya. And sorry that it's a bit blurry, but it's all available on our website and I'll post a link to it. Next slide, please. So in the context of Yemen, which is a fragile country, with the help of a local consultancy, the team was able to collect household and service level data in 2 cities, in Sana'a and Aden. The issue was there were a lot of data gaps as well. And the team supports an emergency health and nutrition project there. However, the recommendations from the consultants were too many, and we had to prioritize given our limited resources. And so the prioritization criteria that we developed, we ranked it, and keeping in mind the immediate needs of cholera mitigation and now COVID.
30 seconds, Nandita.
Next slide. So strategic and integrated planning. So this is the terms of reference and guidance note, which was developed for general use and rolled out in 9 secondary towns in Angola through the use of a participatory master planning process. Next slide. And lastly, just to give you an idea of our work, these are the 4 pillars of citywide inclusive sanitation work. And you've heard a bit on the tools and resources, but we also do knowledge and learning events. A big part of our work is operational support to project teams and building partnerships, as Kate mentioned. This is also key to developing and moving forward. Next slide. Thank you so much. This is, I'll post the link to this so that we don't over time. Thanks, Martin.
Many thanks, Nandita. A lot of food for thought there regarding the role of appropriate and agile urban sanitation planning approaches under a SID-US framework and in different contexts with varying degrees of difficulty. Nandita will post the web page there, so you can also explore the bank SID-US web page. We'll move straight on. Any comments or questions for her, please put them in the chat box as we mentioned for the others. Thank you. We're going to move straight on to our fourth presentation. We're going to hear from Dennis Mwanza and Lawrence Yesi about their efforts in undertaking the groundwork for urban sanitation planning and governance in Nigeria. Dennis serves as RTI International's Senior WASH Advisor. In this role, he's responsible for the capture and technical input of proposals and thought leadership on various technical matters, specifically in urban sanitation, utility reform, and utility governance. Dennis has a rich experience in many years in the sanitation sector from a variety of important previous positions, as you'll see from his bio page on the SID webpage. He will hand over in his presentation to Lawrence, who's an institutional and policy development specialist at RTI, where he plays a key role in their implementation of USAID's EWASH program. Through his work, he's helping strengthen policy, institutional and regulatory frameworks for improved WASH services in urban Nigerian neighborhoods. Over to you, Dennis, and you will hand to Lawrence through your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and great to have you facilitate this session. Please, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you so much. So, just as a start, in terms of context, and I'm sure Nandita may have mentioned a bit, but I know that the World Bank is doing quite a lot in Nigeria in terms of sanitation. But the general situation which may be agreed upon is that at the moment, starting at the policy level, there is no clearly defined institutional home for sanitation. And I put SEPAS there. SEPAS stands for State Environmental Protection Agency, which was created specifically to protect the environment. But because of a gap that existed, in fact, I should say they did not really fill the gap because they are mainly dealing with solid waste management. So if you go to a state and ask who is responsible for sanitation, they'll tell you SEPA, but then you'll find that they actually deal with the solid waste management. Sorry, I should have mentioned at the start that most of the participants here may be aware that Nigeria follows a federal system of governance, and water and sanitation are what are called devolved functions, and so basically a responsibility of each state government, even if there is a federal, federal ministry. In fact, I need to mention that while at the state level, there's no clear home for sanitation, at the federal ministry, there is actually a department of sanitation headed by a director of sanitation and what they call quality control. And, as I think Nandita or I can remember the first presenter mentioned, sometimes we look at sewerage as the only solution, but that is not. And in fact, in Nigeria, in most cities, there's no centralized sewer network, and with a very high open defecation, no fecal sludge treatment plant that I know of. I'm sure there might be one or two. I mean, it's a country of 200 million almost, and 36 states. But whatever the case, in most of them, there's no fecal sludge treatment plant. And you can imagine what this means. This means it's basically what we would call institutional open defecation, because toilets or septic tanks may be emptied. Where this is thrown is everybody's guess. And so what it basically means is that there is very low access to safely managed sanitation, which I think, as we know, is part of the targets for the SDGs. In terms of the impact of this kind of situation, I think these have already been mentioned even previously: economic impact, health impact. I mean, all these call for a need for us to address this challenge that we have now. And what better time now that we have the COVID-19 that even calls for us to address this particular challenge. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so why, I think I've already mentioned in terms of lack of a clear home. Now, thanks to the presentation, I think it was Kate, I can't remember now, or I think it was Liz who talked about the Mozambique case and so on. So at operations, but there's also need for that issue of a clear institutional hope at the government ministry level. And then weak institutional capacity, no budget, and a lot of blah, blah. Now, of course, this has a lot of blah, blah, because as we all might know, since 2000, we've been talking about sanitation being an orphaned baby. We always talk about water and sanitation. And I must say that there's been an improvement, but I think there's still a lot of lip service and not so much action. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So the case for a dedicated ministry, I think basically, as somebody has mentioned, we need at the highest level a clear, dedicated ministry that is responsible and accountable for delivery or non-delivery of sanitation. Because in this respect, we will have at least some level of focus and attention to sanitation, and possibly also there will be that guide and need to push for clear policies and of course sound strategic directions, dedicated budget, and possibly also stronger institution. I must clarify that just having a name in a ministry may not be sufficient. Obviously, you have a ministry for sanitation, but you need to have also a dedicated department with a senior enough civil servant that is responsible for pushing the sanitation agenda. And this is applicable for both rural and urban. Though I need to mention at this particular moment that in most instances, rural sanitation has received a lot of attention. I know that a lot of people always say that that's where the waste problem is worse. But unfortunately, in Nigeria, at least, urban sanitation is also on its knees. It's in it needs a lot of addressing. Next slide. And of course, it increases effective monitoring and evaluation, and obviously learning and how to come up with new mechanisms of all this. And of course, defines the roles of service providers. But at the same time also, as I mentioned on the differences between urban and rural, that helps to clearly know that there's a difference between urban and rural, and the solutions may be different, and which I think to a great extent are different in terms of solving the urban, urban needs for sanitation. Next slide. So RTI, the organization I work for, is actually implementing a $60 million USAID funded EWASH program. EWASH stands for Effective Water Sanitation and Hygiene Program in Nigeria. We're working in 5 states, and it's a reform program for urban water supply and sanitation. And as far as sanitation is concerned, we have facilitated development of new policies for water and sanitation, as well as laws. But I think what is key for me is dedicating or agreeing with the local state governments that there should be a ministry that will be responsible for sanitation. I'm not saying that the ministry has a name of sanitation and so on, like Ministry of Sanitation and so on, but there is at least a state ministry, what they call commissioner, who can be held accountable for delivery or non-delivery of sanitation. That's the Ministry of Water Resources. And then there is also at operational level, which is another very key point, is that the state water boards, which have generally been only responsible for water services in the 5 states that we're working, have now been given or taken over the responsibility of sanitation. And lastly, but not least, the seaways approach, which has already been explained, is something that we have adopted in these 5 states. That is citywide inclusive sanitation. And my colleague Lawrence is going to proceed on this. Please, Lawrence, you can go on.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Well, please, next slide. Thank you, Danny, so much for laying the foundation
Next slide,
and I'm going to continue. So next slide, please. So across, you said e-wash program is working in Nigeria across 5 states of Abia, Delta, Imo, Niger, and Taraba states. So in addition to the challenges Dennis mentioned, on-site, across these states rely completely on on-site sanitation. Access to sewer network is completely absent, and the on-site sanitation is poorly managed and characterized by irregular evacuation and disposal by basically unregistered and unregulated operators, which are basically private operators. So we also have challenges of absence of local ordinances, where there's no single law regulating activities of sanitation across all the value chains. And we have issues of overlapping roles and responsibilities, inadequate funding, and investment by government, indeed the private sector, among others. Please, next slide. So the USID e-wash program implemented by RTI International has developed and is implementing strategies to confront these challenges across the 5 states. First, we mobilize the consciousness of state governments to agree to developing and approving state policies, and also developing appropriate laws and revising existing ones to create the enabling environment for this change to happen. So the change has led to creation of defined institutional homes in state ministries of water resources and the state water boards to provide that enabling environment for service efficiency across all the value chains of on-site sanitation management. So in the ministries of water resources, we have sanitation units, and we also have advocated and they've appointed unit heads, and also in the state water agencies, which are now state water supply and sanitation agencies, but they are focused on sewage system management. So we're also working closely to strengthen institutional capacity, provide capacity building to unit heads to be able to man these units. And we've also pushed to have lands allocated across the 5 states for fecal loss treatment plants. So the other picture on the other side is the newly enacted law in Taraba State. This has happened across the other states, except for Abia, whose law is currently in the State Assembly. And the lower picture shows one of the lands in Delta State. So these are part of the efforts we're making on ground here to change this narrative. Next slide. Yeah, so additionally, the USID e-wash program facilitates the establishment of high-level citywide inclusive sanitation task force to coordinate sanitation activities across the states. And this group is comprised of multiple stakeholders, including civil society organizations, healthcare workers, environmental practitioners, and indeed the private sector. So currently we're undertaking sanitation mapping, and the intention is to develop a citywide sanitation inclusive master plan. And hello? Yeah. So we are on with data collection from the city involving households, institutions, and commercial centers. And then the output of this intervention, we come up with a sheet flow diagram, and we'll have narrative reports on the situation, including demographics and access. So it's just a first step to developing the citywide sanitation, inclusive sanitation master plan, like I mentioned earlier. And while the program is ongoing, we'll try to change the narratives and create an entry point for the investors or other development partners who want to come in to help change this narrative. Thank you. Back to Dennis.
Dennis, back to you.
Lawrence, okay, I think basically what he was trying to explain is that we have this, we're undertaking a sanitation mapping exercise, basically like has been mentioned in terms of citywide inclusive sanitation approach, to get exactly what is the situation on the ground, identify the gaps, the different inequities, and sorry, I did not finish with that the other slide. Anyway, look to get the situation on the ground. And then, of course, the outputs from this is that we hope we can have a reliable sheet flow diagram, but most importantly, a narrative report. And lastly, but not least, is what Lawrence already explained, and this is that we'll have a city sanitation plan, which shows what kind of investments we need to have and where and so on. We're also working on fecal sludge treatment plants, at least coming up with designs for those. Next slide. Yeah, thank you so much. So that is in case you need to contact us, we have our details there. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dennis and Lawrence. That was great. And you've raised some really interesting governance and planning issues from a challenging country context. And your recommendations of a dedicated sanitation ministry is really interesting. And it's an aspect that we at the World Bank have been hotly discussing for different places around the world. And it's actually been part of the AMCAO's Africa Sanitation Policy Guidelines discussions, the pros and cons of standalone ministries or standalone institutions versus those combined. So that's a really good and interesting discussion as well that you raised. Also, the bank's currently preparing a large investment program for water supply and sanitation services in Nigeria. And I know that some of my colleagues working on that project have joined us today and will be very interested to learn more about your planning approaches to urban sanitation in the country. So thanks so much for that. Now, hopefully, last but not least, by no means least, we have Kariuki Mugo. Mugo, can you hear us? Because he's been having connection difficulties. Are you with us, Mugo?
Yes,
excellent.
Martin, can you hear me?
Let me introduce you then. Mugo is the Director of WASH Sector Support for Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, WUSUP, a global organization that helps transform cities to benefit the millions who lack access to water and sanitation. He has over 20 years of experience in managing pro-poor urban and rural WASH programs in Kenya. And Mugo is going to present to us on the importance of understanding the enabling environment in which our urban sanitation services sit or should sit. Over to you, Mugo. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. WhatsApp helps cities to serve low-income people across a number of countries. And in the course of our work, we have been a strong proponents of citywide inclusive sanitation. In the process of trying to test a number of things and to support institutions and small and medium enterprises, we have realized that we need to support creation or strengthening of enabling environment. Next slide, Martin. So, yes. In our own experience, we have realized that enabling environment requires that you have a strong institutional mandates or very clear mandates. You need to have policies and laws. You need to have regulation standards. There needs to be planning systems or mechanisms, and also you need to have financing mechanisms in place. Basically, what we do is we try to look at what can make citywide inclusive sanitation take place and what can make multiple players be able to work with each other as conveniently as possible. Next slide. So we've been doing a number of things, and the first one is trying to clarify mandates. And if you look at mandates, they're basically the biggest thing that stands in the way of sanitation services access and provision. And if you look at, it starts off from the national level to the local level. But again, if you try to concentrate on the national level, it becomes very difficult to have anything done on the grassroots. So what we normally encourage is that during citywide inclusive planning at local level, it's very important to try and lay out institutional framework where you can see how the government institutions, the role they play, the role the private sector plays, and what the users need to do so that you can be able to facilitate those functions. Next slide. We also address issues of policy and legal gaps, and we do that at both national and subnational level. At subnational level in Kenya, we have counties where we support county governments to develop policies and bills. Of particular interest is the county government of Nakuru, which Nadita mentioned, where World Bank has also done countywide inclusive sanitation plan. And Nakuru was the first county to have a sanitation policy, and having that policy in place tells it all. If you look at Nakuru out of the other 47 counties, you'll see how much progress it has made in this country in terms of providing sanitation, and especially non-sewer sanitation. We also have a number of similar processes going on in a number of counties, but also we try to strengthen national sanitation policy. There's a process underway with many other stakeholders, and we are part of that conversation, and we think it will change the whole policy environment and unlock a lot of potential for inclusive sanitation investment services. Next slide. Next slide, please. Whew. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Muga, but maybe you can't see the change in slides.
Okay, yes. So the other thing that needs to be done is to initiate planning mechanisms. And I think this is a problem with many developing countries, where planning is not a very important element of development or investment, public investment. So when we advocate for citywide inclusive sanitation, it's very important to try and initiate mechanisms for planning at local level. And possibly the starting point would be a sheet flow diagram to see how much waste is treated and how much waste is untreated, to be able to start that conversation, because this is an easier tool for each and every stakeholder to be able to understand. Next slide. Yeah, one of the cities where we're working, we've been able to work with a number of stakeholders, the local utility, Malindi Water, some other private sector like Sanitation, and we've been able to bring together some stakeholder kind of mechanisms where people sit together and discuss the issues of sanitation and what needs to be done, and finding solutions when sitting all around the table, having conversations and contributing. And this has been a number of players coming into action: the county government, the utility, the local private sector, the municipal board, all sitting together and bringing other stakeholders to be able to look at how a plan can be developed for a city that has no other plan that addresses basic services, and especially solid waste management and sanitation. So this is something that can be an ad hoc committee, or you can form a committee with a TOR for this specific purpose, or you can use any other mechanism that coordinates stakeholders who can be influential or who have a good idea of how services should be planned for the city. Next slide. It's also important to look at the issue of financing. And one of the things that we facilitate is conversations around financing mechanisms and sources, and looking at especially domestic resources, whether it's taxes or levies. And we've done a number of those things around some counties, and especially in Nakuru, where we're having conversations around a local surcharge for water customers to pay a small subsidy to enable the utility to invest in some services for the unserved. You can also do other things like analyzing investment costs, and that can be done when you have a citywide inclusive sanitation plan. It's also very important to analyze how finances flow within a particular location, seeing what the residents can be able to pay, what the government and other partners can be able to put in, where it goes, and what kind of investment it goes into, so that resources are not invested where roles are duplicated, so that you can get a maximum impact out of the resources that are available. Next slide, please. I think the last thing I want to talk about is a kind of a small mechanisms for investment, and we particularly think of a small and medium private sector as service providers, and we always try to facilitate a growth of SMEs, and also facilitate mechanisms for them to work with public sector. Without that continuum working, there's always a missing link, because public institutions cannot be able to provide most of the services. Of particular interest is some work that we do in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, the SWIP model, whereby we utilize dormant public capacity. Utilities there have VTOs, which are not well utilized. So we've developed a model whereby SMEs can lease these VTOs, and then a contract that also serves, takes the interest of low-income people, be able to utilize those public resources to provide a service that the public sector is not able to provide. We also do a lot of incubating and connecting SMEs, like I said earlier, and we've done quite some work across many cities, with Lusaka. This is a case of Kisumu, whereby the market didn't have any manual pit emptiers, and that was a big problem. So one of the things that we had to do to start to catalyze the FSM market was to build the capacity of local SMEs, and to develop some standards for them, which are SOPs that they use to contract with the government entities to be able to tip waste and to be able to meet certain operational standards that meet public health requirements. And we have seen that actually has triggered a lot of movement in terms of small private sector and household investment into pit emptying and latrine construction. I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Mugo. I'm very pleased that your connection finally worked, because I know you had trouble joining us. That was great. And you provided a comprehensive and succinct overview of the importance of the enabling environment for allowing the urban sanitation sector to move forward. And of course, I was discussing with a colleague earlier that there are different interpretations or different frameworks for enabling environments, but I thought that the way you described it, looking at the institutions, the policies and laws, the regulation, the planning and the financing, summarize very nicely the key elements of an enabling environment. So that was great, and I think the presentation sets us up nicely as well. Well, all of them do, obviously, for a Q&A session. And I'm just checking our time, and we're doing well. We are actually where we should be, which is fantastic. So thank you to all the presenters for that. I'm gonna ask a couple of. I'm gonna start off because the title of the webinar talked obviously about urban sanitation, and you've done a fantastic job, all of you, to talk a lot about different elements of sanitation planning and implementation and service delivery. But I was going to go back to Kate, hoping she's still with us, and just ask if she's got some reflections on the urban sanitation health interface, obviously being our representative at the World Health Organization and having worked so much on this, whether you've got any pointers for us. And obviously we know you have your sanitation safety planning manual that you worked on a year or so ago. I just thought it might be interesting for you to give us some reflections, because some of the audience will be coming at development from the health perspective. If you've got any words of wisdom for us from that perspective, Kate, I hope you don't mind me dropping that question on you. No,
not at all. So firstly, would be just about the role of the health sector. I mean, that's one of the key recommendations within the sanitation and health guidelines. Certainly not that the health sector should deliver all of sanitation, but they've got really, really important roles to play, and they're in the guidelines. I won't go through them, but we really need to work with those health sector actors to make sure that sanitation systems are really protective of health. So I think that's really important that they're playing that role, because ultimately the benefits accrue to the health sector. The second is around sanitation safety planning, or more broadly what we would call risk-based planning. So if we of course, we realize we need to kind of jump a cliff here, right? It's a huge task. And if we're to get the best health bang for our buck, we really need to be mobilizing some of that health data and health risk-based planning to put that investment where it's going to make the most difference for health. So when we sort of use those terms about risk-based prioritization, that's really what we mean in a nutshell. And then the third thing I would say is around health programming. So there's lots of health activities, whether those are neglected tropical diseases, intestinal worms, trachoma, cholera. What we sort of see sometimes is sort of people trying to go it alone in the health sector, doing WASH work, understanding that WASH is important, but not necessarily bringing to bear all of the experience in the sector that's built up over years. So really just encouraging health sector colleagues to work with the WASH sector, trying to use that data to draw them into your specific health issue and make sure that the way that those WASH interventions are being implemented is really breaking transmission of the disease that you're interested in. So that's really what we mean by about targeting according to health risk and tailoring health WASH programs towards the local health risks. That's it from me.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I'd just like to recognise that a number of the presenters have been answering the questions in the chat box. Kate, Nandita and Liz and others as well. And I see Mugo's doing that now, which is great. I just like to take the fact that I'm moderating this. I tend, obviously health is a very, very important dimension of sanitation, of the absence of sanitation, or of the benefit of appropriate sanitation services. I often say that the beauty of sanitation is that it touches on so many elements of the development agenda. Health obviously is clearly one, the environment, quality of life, economics, empowerment, but also the curse of our sector is that it touches on everything, and sometimes we have to fight to have a seat at the table in some development settings. And I think that's also because there are coping mechanisms, because whether we like it or not, like with water supply, everyone has to have some sort of, everyone has to go every day, let's put it that way. So you have to do it. And so you have to have your own coping mechanisms, and you take care of the issue yourself. So there tends to be this silent emergency going on in which we get used to this business as usual, as it were, with people sorting their own services out. And then when big crises come along, like the cholera outbreak in Peru in the early 90s, or the cholera outbreak in Southern Africa in the early 2000s as examples. In Peru, it caused billions of dollars in lost revenue from exports because of the cholera outbreak in the ports there. And then people start paying attention to it, and then it goes off the agenda again, 4 or 5 years later. Someone that I like to quote often is Neil MacLeod of eThekwini Water and Sanitation, who always says, never let a good crisis go to waste. And he used the cholera crisis that affected eThekwini municipality in South Africa to make the case from the health costs, the additional health burden that was brought about by the cholera, to get the municipal government to invest in sanitation and invest seriously in sanitation. So again, just making some of those links. Let me take a quick look at whether we have any pending questions, because the team behind the scenes has been gathering those together for me. So let me do a quick round of these questions then. So we have a question from Tanvi. Could Liz reflect on how USAID is responding to increased local service provider needs and falling revenues during COVID? I'm just going to throw these questions out and then I'll come back to each of you. From David Painter, also to Liz, what do you feel should be done at USAID policy level to actually get more field missions to move into urban sanitation investment? And then a question for Mugo from Robert. It appears that for the past 10 years, most of the progressive WASH innovations in Kenya seem to have come out of Kisumu and Nakuru counties, both of which are featured in presentations today. Whether you have any thoughts on why that might be the case. That's an interesting question. And then for Dennis, with the clamour for a small government in the centre in Nigeria, what other strategies could come in handy to attract budgetary allocation and general funding into the sanitation sector in Nigeria? So Liz, if you're there, if you could maybe take those first two questions for us.
Yeah, happy to. I think the first one was on the COVID-19 impacts on the sector. And I put a bit of this in the chat, but it's something we've been tracking really closely, as I think other donors and partners in the sector have been. The data around service provider impacts are more robust for the water sector subsector than the sanitation subsector. We're certainly hearing sort of panicked cries from many water utilities and small scale water providers that they're just running out of money, and service cuts are already happening in some places. And that seems to be the area also that governments and the development partners are focused more on than sanitation. But it is something we're tracking sanitation at all levels. So service providers we've seen are having less demand. Households are just sort of deferring expenses like pit emptying or purchases of latrines right now. And we have some analysis that should be coming out within the next couple of weeks on what those impacts look like and what we need to do. Our response, I put a link in the chat to an entire page of kind of information, stories, et cetera, on what's happening at USAID to mitigate impacts. It's really primarily happening out of our field missions, since they have the best knowledge of sort of the on the ground issues and what the priorities are. But I can put that back in the chat again for anyone who's interested, so you can take a look more closely. The second question.
Go ahead, yes, please, with the second question, please, yeah.
Yeah, the second question was about the policy level to get more missions moving into urban sanitation. We've actually, I think in the past few years, had a lot of growth in this area, in addition to some missions like Indonesia and India that have a long history of working on urban sanitation. And I think some of that can be attributed to some policy changes. In the USAID Water and Development Plan under the Global Water Strategy that came out in 2017, sanitation was elevated to be a development result right alongside water. So rather than kind of burying everything together in WASH, we tried to really pull out sanitation as being very important, with a particular sub-objective around safely managed sanitation and a focus on urban environments. So, I think that some of the policy changes have happened, but at USAID, it can take a few years for that to materialize in our programming. So I think it's actually a shift that we're seeing right now and will continue to grow.
Liz, that resonates with us at the World Bank, exactly what you said. We tend to be big tankers in some ways, and changing direction can take a while. We've been working on advocacy at the bank, within the bank, with our bank staff and through them, our government counterparts, on citywide inclusive sanitation for a couple of years now, 2 to 3 years, and we're now seeing that traction. But again, probably it's the same with USAID, our projects take a while to prepare and to implement. So it's like the tanker changing course, it can take a while. So that's great. That's great to hear. Also on the COVID response, I just add the bank seeing more of that as well, as you implied. Other development agencies are seeing that issue of utilities being asked to provide free water, and this having an impact on their revenues. And some of our policy lending is helping with that issue. And we've also got some toolkits for utilities to help them think about emergency responses as well. And we can, if you contact us, if anyone's interested, we can share that with you. But thanks for those answers, Liz. And as I say, it resonates a lot with what we're doing as well at the bank. And so, Mugo, there was a question for you, if you're still with us.
Yes. Yeah, Robert wanted to know how come Nakuru and Kisumu counties are more progressive. And if you look at the issues that I've raised, they are more advanced or more addressed in these locations. But I'd like to mention one or two things. The first one is institutional coordination in these counties is stronger, because lack of clarity of mandates doesn't stand in the way of things happening. So there are mechanisms for coordination of institutional players around these counties. so there's more openness. The second one is the strength of utilities, of service providers. You find that the water utilities there are progressive, they have better governance, they are more open to different models and technologies of providing non-sewer sanitation. So they're better performing generally. So the strength of institutions is key. And also this general, this commitment of the leadership, whether it's the governors or utility managers. You have very committed leaders who drive the entire agenda. And maybe also to mention that policy and regulatory environment is stronger. They have regulations, they have policies in place, and that is what creates the environment for investment and service provision. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mugo, and that resonates with our experience from other countries. And we've often debated this issue of picking a winner in a decentralized context, be it states in a federal government such as Nigeria or Brazil, where I've worked a lot, or counties, as you're talking about now. You know, do you go with the ones that are better prepared and therefore you can demonstrate success, or do you go with the weaker ones? And I think it's a really interesting discussion as well. Just demonstrating success, picking winners, where are the champions, and then showing showing others, leading the way, as it were. And I think that's a nice segue to the question for Dennis for Nigeria, because as I said, we're thinking of that model as well in our engagement there, Dennis, to which are the states and which are the LGAs, the local government administrations, where we can work with and demonstrate success in the water and in the sanitation sector to allow for its scale up. So Dennis, there was a question for you about this issue of the clamour for small government at the centre versus strategies to attract budgetary allocation. I don't know if you have some thoughts for us on that, Dennis.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think for me, the major problem basically is that urban sanitation has generally been the elephant in the room that we are not seeing, that a lot of political leaders and even engineers and so on were not seeing, and yet an elephant really is something that should be obvious. And why I'm saying this is that imagine you're such a rich person, even if you're not rich, but you're able to build a house and have a septic tank. And as long as somebody comes to empty your septic tank, you don't ask, where are you taking this waste? And obviously, it's, as I said earlier on, it's everybody's guess. So how can the state government, even a small state government, but the good thing is that all the state governments do get some funding from the federal government. I think the solution that we have proposed in terms of having a ministry that is accountable for sanitation. Now here again, thanks for raising that issue about the debate on whether it's one ministry or not. I'm not necessarily saying we should have a ministry of sanitation alone. It might be Ministry of Environment and so on, but we must make sure that there's a minister who you can hold accountable for sanitation. So, for example, who can make sure that there's a budget, and then there's, of course, clarity of roles and raising the profile of sanitation. I think all of us here have been talking about lack of elevation of urban sanitation, up on this. So you'll find that when you look at the government budgets, you ask yourself, where is the budget line for sanitation? Somebody will tell you it's underwater and sanitation. And then now you look at the details, you find that everything is just talking about water, and so on. You go to Ministry of Health, yes, there will be sanitation most likely, but it will be more on public awareness and so on, rather than construction of physical infrastructure, whether toilets, the whole issues of emptying and transportation that we've been talking about, as well as treatment facilities. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dennis. That's great. I'm going to wrap up this section of the Q&A now. For me, this has been fantastic, and I'm looking forward personally, Nandita and I and the bank team to engaging with Liz and her work, with Dennis and Lawrence, with Mugo, of course, and to continue working with Kate. So this has been great, and I like the feeling of the synergy of the direction that all these different organisation development agencies are going in. We're coming together around an approach, and it's really positive and great to see. So I wanted to thank our excellent and inspiring presenters today. Thank you all very much. But also, thank you for participating, the audience. And we've had over 60 people throughout the discussion, and for your interesting and great observations, and for being with us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ari Istander and Paul Sherman of SID for some closing words. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin, and thank you again to everyone, all the presenters, especially to Kate, Liz, Nandita, Dennis, Lawrence, and of course Karayuki, that are able to join us and present on this topic. I just want to say on behalf of the SID working group here, thank you again, and thank you for everybody for attending. I know for some of us it's already late afternoon, some of us it's mid-morning, so thank you again. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paul, who's with SID Washington, to talk more about the survey that's popping up on the screen at the moment. Thank you again, everybody.
Great, thanks, Ari. So and thank you to all the speakers and Martin as the moderator for participating. We really do appreciate it. I think it was a very lively discussion, and we appreciate everybody's participation in the chat. I think that was very lively too, and it was great. So I'll just, as a good timing, because it just popped up in the chat. As was mentioned, please fill out, we have a survey we just posted in the chat. Please feel free to fill it out. We really do appreciate your feedback, and we really do take it into consideration as we move forward with planning our events in the future. It really helps us to develop new event ideas and also formats and everything else that we do. And we wouldn't be able to do what we do without all of you providing your feedback to us. So please feel free to fill that out. And with that, I will close this out. Thank you very much for participating, and we hopefully we'll see you at a future SID-W events, and hope you continue to stay safe and healthy. Thanks, everybody.